All right, so welcome to week 3. Today is actually the midpoint. We're halfway done with boot camp. Good job, everybody. It's kind of flying by. It feels like just a few days ago that we had our first session, but here we are already almost halfway through. Hopefully you guys have found it useful so far and have picked up on some things. Today we're going to be going over React. But before that, does anybody have any questions from any of the material from last week or projects or anything like that? Sweet. So we can get into today's agenda. So as usual, we're going to have our review Kahoot. This time we have a surprise prize for the winner. It's going to be a short Kahoot as well, because we have a lot of content to cover today. Today we're going to be going over what is JSX, React and React components. Then we're going to talk about what props are in React. These probably don't mean much to you now, but hopefully by the time we're done with today, you'll get an understanding of these. And then we have a few other updates. The second milestone, the one that covers a lot of the JavaScript stuff, that's going to be due tomorrow at basically midnight. And then one other update is we've been having our boot camps every Monday and Thursday, but next Thursday, we're going to be having a general meeting instead of this boot camp session. So that'll be in the same room as our first general meeting. So I think it's 14249 just down the hall. And we'll still have our Monday boot camp, but the Thursday one will be that general meeting. So we're not going to have our boot camp session this following week. And then here's the schedule. Last week we covered JavaScript and Node. Today we're covering up some of the React basics. We're going to touch a little bit more onto React further down the road, but React is a pretty good topic, is a pretty large topic, and we want to kind of break it up into 2 sections so that there's enough you guys will have time to work with it, more time on the projects to get help, and a few other reasons. Anything else? Sweet. So we're going to go straight into the Kahoot, and a reminder, there is a prize today. More. Hide these meeting controls. Kahoot. Play as guest. Continue as guest. Classic. Ooh, it's Halloween themed. We'll give everybody a bit to join. Feel free to work with a partner if you want, or work alone, whatever works best for you. We'll get started here soon. It seems we're spread out. I don't know if it's more.
Yeah, we definitely split them like our first session.
Yeah.
Like these are all the milestone. It's like 23.
I know still one of the YouTube videos recording just getting a good amount of views. So
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, some people like, I don't know, some people are always gonna be like, oh, I'm just gonna do this asynchronously.
yeah, and plus I'll send out the emails after this meeting. So I need somebody to like present it and really like hype it up. Like this item was pawned from a thing that has this history. It's number 1 out of 4. Yeah, only one of this part of exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's gonna slow them down though if they can.
It's really just gonna be the speed, I think, that matters showing.
Yeah.
It's gonna be gone quick one.
Is everybody in? Are we waiting on anybody? Sweet, we're gonna go ahead and get started then. The first question is, again, this is gonna cover JavaScript and Node. Wait. So yeah, first question is, what is the correct syntax for getting an element by ID in JavaScript? You really kind of gave it to us with the get an element by ID in the question.
Well, that's the part that isn't. I don't change that part though.
All right, pretty good. Good stuff, everybody. Number 2. What is the most common? Again, good stuff. Good stuff. Question number 3, coming right up. So yeah, you do need those parentheses around your scoreboard. I feel like Ryan and Ryan are always near the top. And then we have our final question. You want to explain this?
I think most people got it. Yeah, npm install is going to install all the dependencies on your dependency list. So if any were added.
Sweet. So our winner, again, we have the prize. Good stuff, Drew and Jenny. J&D, good stuff. And in first, we have So this is a very special prize I found in today. It is a Pokemon card, which was out by the video feed. It's a good one. It's a Ranger. Good stuff though. Really? Sweet. And I just reading controls.
Alright, so let's jump right into it. So today we're going to be talking about React, and I'm pretty excited to talk about this topic. React is a pretty cool tool that we can use for front-end development. I have a lot of fun using it, so I think that y'all will enjoy getting to actually use this. A little more fun than just writing a bunch of HTML all over again. So first, let's talk about why we're learning React. Like all the other tools that we've been using, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, it's pretty much the industry standard for full stack development. React's got a little bit of other competitors, different packages you can use, but it's a pretty common one, and you'll see it in a lot of companies and internships, things like that. It's going to be a useful tool to know. So it's also pretty useful in our code when we want to kind of do more complex stuff with our websites than we're doing right now. So React does a couple pretty important things for us. One of the main things, it's going to eliminate a lot of the tedious repetition that I'm assuming some of you all have seen so far, kind of writing the same HTML pages over and over again, copy and pasting a lot of code, stuff like that. React's going to kind of take this out and let us write that code once and reuse it as much as we want. It's going to organize our code a little bit better as well. So it's going to group kind of our functions and our format together. We'll kind of explain that a little bit more later, but it's going to make our code base easier to navigate. And then it kind of isolates functionality. So it kind of takes chunks of our website and breaks it up so it's easier to digest and understand. And then finally, we'll get into more detail kind of about what this means later, but React allows us to update certain parts of our website individually instead of having to maybe refresh the entire thing, reload a bunch of data, stuff like that. That kind of, again, isolates little chunks of our website. So what exactly is React? So React is going to be one of the most powerful front-end tools that you'll be using in your project teams. So it's important to keep in mind that we're still working on the front end here, kind of working with what users are going to be seeing, what they're going to interact with. So when you're working with React, it's all kind of on the front of the web page. So React is just a JavaScript library or framework for building these user interfaces. It's a package that we'll download with Node that we talked about last time and kind of bring some new code into our code base. So React focuses a lot on what's called component-based development. Again, we'll kind of talk more about what this means later, but essentially, like I've explained, it's going to take our website, break it up, and kind of isolate things in a more digestible manner. And then it's highly scalable as well. So we can reuse a lot of this code. We can make really complex and large websites pretty fast without having to have a million different files floating around, kind of doing the same thing over and over again. And then you can see kind of on the image there, there's a ton of like high profile tech companies that use React on their websites, things like that. So this is a really relevant tool if this is anything that you're looking at doing for a career, things like that.
Okay, so now we're going to go over JSX, which is essentially like the file type that you use to write React in. So JSX is React's language. So we've learned HTML files, we've learned CSS files, we've learned JS files. And now we're going to learn JSX files. So JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML, allows us to write HTML inside of our JavaScript code. So at its core, you can write just pure JavaScript in a JSX file and it will work as expected. But what JSX kind of allows you to do is it creates this new data type that allows you to put HTML as like a new data type. So we have integers, we have strings, we have Booleans, now we have HTML. So if you look at that code snippet at the very bottom, we can create like a variable called element and just set it equal to this h1 tag called hello world. And additionally, you can kind of get into this weird nested thing where inside of your HTML, you can also put JavaScript. So everyone remembers template literals. They're like the backtick thing for strings that allow you to put like JavaScript code in your strings. Well, React has something similar. So if you want to put JavaScript inside of your HTML, you just put brackets around it. There's no $sign at the front. It's only brackets. And then you can write JavaScript and you can put like a mathematical expression. You can put a function call. You can put a variable in there. And then React will read that and it will simplify it to 2 + 3 is the number 5. Yes?
How do you use like, how do you include like this curly brackets if you just wanted to use it as like text without triggering JavaScript call?
Oh, you're like escaping the, that is a good question. Do you know the answers? I'd assume you put a backslash in front of it. That's how you do it in like most languages, but that's not an affirmative answer.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure that's an easy Google. I don't know that off the top of my head.
Yeah. Okay, so far we've used DOM manipulation, which is like that JavaScript stuff we've covered the last 2 sessions in order to like alter our website. But now with JSX, you can have your JavaScript and your HTML in the same file. So if you look at this code snippet again, we can make this function called say hello, and then directly in the same file, right below it, we can make this new variable called hi button, and it's a button. And we make on click and set it equal to say hello. Also, important thing to note, React syntax is like not going to be the exact same as like your HTML. So if you remember from the Kahoot, on click would be all lowercase and you'd put say hello in a string. Here, say hello is JavaScript. So you're putting the curly brackets around it and you're just passing in the function. Also make sure you don't put like the parentheses there because otherwise you're going to call the function. But you're just passing in that function as a variable in this case. That makes sense? Okay, and then here's a little bit more JavaScript JSX syntax. So if you look at this example code at the bottom, whenever you're creating like a new variable in JSX, you can only have the variables equal to like one grouping of HTML. So what that means is you have to have like an outermost element. So you know how HTML is nested? You can't have like multiple nested things back on top of each other. There has to be like an outermost thing containing it. So that's what the div is kind of doing in this case, is we couldn't just say username element equals the hello line and the p line. You have to put a div around it or some other thing that kind of combines those two into like a single HTML grouping. And then again, we see that example of putting JavaScript inside of your HTML. So there's like brackets, and then that blue is like a function, and then you're passing in username, which is like a variable in this case. So that's like a slightly more complicated example. Any questions so far? Cool.
So that was a brief overview of just what React can do, but now we're going to get into more like the practical side of things, and a lot of that is going to be React components. That's one of the key things that separates React from HTML, and one of the key reasons why you actually want to include this in addition to the HTML in your page. So what is a component? Components are similar to JSX elements we have shown so far, but they really allow you to reuse your code in a way that we haven't been able to do quite before. So in all of your projects, you might have like each of your recipe pages, and you had to like put all of that information everywhere. But using something like a component, we can actually render the data and make those pages dynamically. And that's a super powerful tool we can use. And what they do is essentially they allow us to define our own custom HTML elements. So we're no longer going to be restricted to like the P tags, the A tags, the header tags, all of those things. We're going to have functionality to create components, and then we can use those components as tags. So going on to an example of how a component is actually like super useful. On the right, we have our project that we've been working on so far, and all of these three things right here, here, and here, they all contain very similar data. So they contain the recipe name, an image, and a description. And what we're actually going to be doing in this third milestone is making our pages that we made so far and putting them into components. So like in this example, this will become a component. This will become a component, so will that. And that's like a super powerful tool because that means we're only going to have to write that component code once. Here it's only 3 examples, but imagine you have hundreds of recipes. That's going to save so much time and just a really powerful tool we have learned so far. We're also going to make our nav bar a component. And I know like most of you have probably put your nav bar in each of your pages, but by making it into a component, we can put it just one place and it'll exist on our entire code. Yeah. Any questions about components so far? Sweet. So you might already be like figuring out some ideas of how components are useful, but they're really good at eliminating repetition. So if you're writing the same code more than once, chances are you should probably be using a component to do so. And we'll actually get into a demo that uses those, but for now, we're just going over conceptually. One example is the recipe page or the recipe preview like we just talked about. And then components, they actually organize our page into sections by grouping display and functionality. And what that really means is think about like a page with a search bar and a shopping cart. Some of your pages might have like two very different things. And say maybe if you want to change your search bar, you don't want to have to like re-render the whole page. So by putting it inside of a component, only the component will be re-rendered. That's going to improve things like performance, and actually it's going to improve the development time as well once you get a hang of it. So it's really good at, I guess, creating little kind of code snippets, and only those are going to be rendered as opposed to a whole page. And then another benefit of it is it's really good for writing code spanning many pages. An example of that in our project, again, is that nav bar. We put it in all of our pages, and I don't know, say if we added another page, we'd have to add it into all of those pages. But by putting that into a component, we're only going to have to make that change in one place. That's going to end up saving us a lot of time in the future, and it really just speeds up development once you get a hang of it. So as mentioned earlier, components can be individually rendered and updated. So I guess going back to this slide, if somebody like changes the content of one of those components, only that component is going to be changed. That's just going to, I guess, speed up the performance. It's going to mean you need less like Wi-Fi or throughput to actually re-render your whole page. So super, super important, super useful.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of what rendering means and how React is doing that now. So we could give you all kind of a really complicated technical explanation of what rendering is and what it means. But to be totally honest, it's not very practically useful when we're developing stuff. It's kind of good, interesting to know and have in the back of our heads, but we're not going to get too deep into it today just for the sake of time and explanation. So like Cole was explaining, we can kind of re-render and update individual parts of our website. And essentially what that means is when data changes or when different kind of things need to happen in our website, instead of having to refresh the whole thing, reload everything back into the browser and things like that, we could just change one aspect of it. So let's say the color value of our image changes, we can go ahead and just update that single image instead of reloading maybe a page with thousands of lines of text. And then we can also force React to re-render when we need to. So if we change data ourselves and want to re-render it and show it before React does it automatically, we can kind of do that on our own.
Make sure I'm screen sharing. I think I am, but okay, I am.
Great.
That would be bad.
Thanks. Okay. So now let's kind of talk about more how you'll make components and what they look like in your code. So there are two different types of components that you could be writing with React: functional and class-based components. So functional components are simply JavaScript functions that return that JSX that Vance was talking about. So you can see this example on the bottom. It's a little bit small, but we just have a function called shopping cart, and it returns an HTML element, which is that paragraph tag there, saying the number of items, and then we have that JavaScript variable inside the curly braces. So it's pretty similar stuff that we've seen so far. And it's a pretty straightforward functional-based component that we would call shopping cart, and we could use that shopping cart tag in our code to render this HTML that we see there. So traditionally in React, functional components had a little bit less capabilities than our other option class-based components. And now they have pretty similar capabilities. We can use things like hooks to mimic more complex behavior. That's a little bit of a more advanced topic that we'll talk about later down the line, but just kind of a good thing to have in the back of your head to note that there are some differences between these. And then class-based components. So you can define them as classes that hold multiple functions, maybe different data, and it's just kind of a larger scale component that is going to be just look a little bit different, but again, it's pretty similar functionality overall. And then one of the main differences with the class-based component is it uses a render method inside of it, and that'll be constant across every class-based component, and that's what's going to return your JSX that you want to actually see on the screen. So we can see on the example on the right, we just have class shopping cart, the same name as our functional-based component, and then the extends React component is just the React syntax way of telling JavaScript that this is a component that'll be constant across every class-based component. And then inside our render method, we render pretty much the exact same thing. That's just that JSX that's going to display to the screen when we render the product.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So should I use functional components or class-based components when I'm working on my project?
Well, it kind of depends on what you want to do with them. For our project's purpose, we're going to be using functional components just because they're a little bit easier to understand, and we're going to be using them more often in our project teams. You'll find use for both of them, but for now, you'll want to stick with the functional components. It's just good to kind of know how the difference between them works, and that way, again, if you're looking maybe on Stack Overflow, things like that, see a class-based component, you can adapt that syntax in your code. So. Okay, and then so there's some quirky React and JSX syntax that we'll just kind of explain here. So kind of like Vance explained earlier, there's a little bit slightly different syntax between JSX and HTML. Some of these things include, a lot of JSX syntax has self-closing tags. So instead of maybe, 2 paragraph tags, you would, I guess paragraphs is a bad example, but div tags, you could self-close it in JSX if you wanted to, although that's not very useful. Images and CSS both have to be imported into your React components. So this isn't anything that's like super hard to do. You can find resources online of actual syntax on how to do it, and we'll go over it in the demo a bit, but it's just an extra step you have to get to see your CSS and your images in your components. Images should be stored inside your public folder inside your React app. So when you do download the React package from NPM, it'll kind of give you a lot of starter code to work with and different files. One of these files is the public folder. That's where you're going to put images. This is a pretty common error of like, if you're not seeing your image on your React components, it's most likely going to be because it's not in the public folder or it's not imported. So just some things to think about when you start developing with this stuff. And then some names change between JSX and React and traditional JavaScript. This is because mixing HTML and JavaScript has some names kind of reserved for it that you can't reuse in HTML. So it has to be changed a little bit. So things like onClick with the quotes around it becomes onClick with the capital C, as Vance explained, and then just the name of the function passed in. A common mistake, again, if you passed in the function with the parentheses at the end of it into the JSX on the right-hand side, you would actually run that function as soon as it's called in there. And this just might give you some weird bugs. So it's just a small syntactic thing to pay attention to. And then you want to make sure when you're making those React components that all their names are capitalized. You can see that I did this in the example components here. The name shopping cart is capitalized, and that's just going to be important if you want to actually see your code get rendered. And then there's a ton more differences, just kind of small little syntactic things that may trip you up here and there. We have a resource on some of the most common things linked. This will be on the Notion later for y'all to look at, but just good to keep in mind that there are a few weird syntax things that change that we can't go over completely today. So.
Another big one is the inline CSS. If you use that in your projects, it's going to have a slightly different syntax. Hopefully we'll cover that in the demo.
Okay, so now I'm just going to give a brief overview of how you're going to actually use components so you can see kind of at the high level how this can work on your website. So in the top code snippet up here, we have a functional based component, kind of how I showed a few slides earlier. It's called Hello World, and all it does is return that div tag with a paragraph element inside of it. So we're just going to see some text displayed on the screen from that. And then if we move into our second code snippet, this will be inside of a file called app.js. This is another thing that React is going to kind of give you when you install it into your project. And we'll go in more into detail about kind of the significance of app.js, but you can just see that inside of where the app function is returning, you use that hello world tag as a single closed element. And that's just going to replace basically that chunk of code is going to have all the stuff that's returned as JSX in place of it. So just kind of like using those custom defined HTML elements is one way to think about it. And then just as another note, we do have to import our components. You can see on the top line there, just another thing to keep in mind when you're developing. Okay. Now we're doing a demo.
Are there any questions before we get into the demo? The demo is going to cover a lot of the stuff we just talked about, but any brief questions? Sweet. So feel free to follow along with us on this demo. Hopefully you'll need to have NPM installed to do so. If not, don't worry about it. I'll make sure to post the code into the Notion pages. So if you're missing anything, that'll be fine. So can you do it like here? So yeah, more hide this. So the very first thing we're gonna do when we create an React app is we're actually gonna need to create that, and we're gonna do that from the command line. If you have Node installed, you can just run the command npx and then create. Sorry, let me zoom in actually. Create React app, and then whatever you want to call it. We're gonna call it component demo. In this example, and it might take it a little bit to start. Especially with campus Wi-Fi, but it is important. And we're actually going to go into like I guess what gets created, because a lot does get created when we create a new React app. Yeah, that'd be great. Sweet. And should just about be finished. Once we actually see what it creates, we're going to see why it took so long, because a lot does get created. And here we go. We actually can use our terminal. We can see that component demo was created. And what first thing we're going to want to do is go into that component demo. It's also here, it was created, and there's a lot to it. So very briefly, I'm going to go over the file structure and what was created. So we'll see some familiar files like package.json in your README, and then we'll also see that node modules. So there's going to be quite a lot of things inside those node modules and package. So things like React are actually imported once we run that command. So something like that gets imported, as well as like some testing software and just some other stuff like that. And then there's going to be two folders that get created, public and our source file. If we go ahead and open the public one, we'll see some common things, such as our index.html file. Let me zoom in one more time. And the index.html file, we're surprisingly not going to be touching that much. And we're not going to be touching it all that much, because inside of our source file, there's going to be a new file created called app.js. And that app.js is actually going to, I guess, it's going to take that DOM element called root, and it's basically going to put it inside of the app.js. And this is going to be all of the code. And if we actually go into this, we can run our npm start, and that's going to start our React server. And hopefully it'll open it up for us in the local host. And we'll actually see what the default React page looks like. So here we have it. We have this like spinning little circle, and it tells us to edit the source/app.js and then save it to reload. One good thing is now we're not going to have to refresh all of our browser every time we make a change. So if like I want to get rid of edit, it'll just do it automatically for us whenever we save our code. And that's one of those good, another thing that kind of took, another reason why it took so long to, I guess, download React and create that React app, because that was another package that was being created. And after this, we're actually not going to use a lot of this code. Obviously, this isn't going to be something we're looking at, so we can go ahead and delete a lot of this stuff. We'll keep the div that has the kind of as the root or the outermost tag, and we'll leave that the same. So we should see nothing in there. That's what we want. Very briefly, we see the app.css, and that contained a lot of the stuff that was in our, I guess, the React page we just saw, the template. We're not going to need that, so we can go ahead and delete that. We're not going to worry about any of the other files for now. They're not as important, but like if you want to delete them, you can, but they do no harm, so we'll just leave them for now. And actually going and getting started, we're gonna create, we can like start to create some HTML in our JavaScript, or in our JS file. Hello world, everybody's favorite example. Why are my AirPods connected? Oops. Let me make sure that's fixed. But we can actually see it gets changed there. Let me make sure that it's not using my AirPods. Okay, sweet. This one. And we should be good to go ahead and get started. So we're going to kind of create some components, but we'll use a H1 tag and we'll say Cole's concoctions. That's one of those, just to see, like, here it is, should be good. And then we'll actually create a class. We'll call it a new div, and we'll put some stuff inside of that. We'll actually do a recipe preview. So how we've seen on the milestone in the example we saw of the components earlier, we're going to be recreating that in our demo. And so what goes into that is going to be the recipe. So we can put another p tag with like pasta primavera. We can put another tag with an image. And we mentioned there's a little bit of a difference between images earlier. That's only the case if you're using images that you put into your actual code. If you're going to steal like image from the internet, you don't need to worry about it. You can use the same format as you would just in your HTML. So that's what we'll do in this example. So we'll put that, and we'll make sure to include that alt tag, which is going to be our pasta image. Sorry if that's kind of got cut off screen, but we can refresh our page and we can see that now it got re-rendered, and we'll actually give it a width of about maybe 200 pixels. That should look fine, and a lot smaller. And one other thing we'll add is a recipe description. And so we'll say pasta primavera is a dish that ... that could be a longer thing. And now we're actually going to create some styles because this isn't that exciting. So we're going to go into our app. I guess we should create a class for it first. So one of those differences we're talking about is we should use class name instead of class when creating something. And we'll just call it outline. That we can use that here. What should we do for our CSS? We can add a border, 2 pixels of solid, I don't know, gray. Bam. We should see that now everything's surrounded in a div or a border. We can add a background color. This should be new, sure, anti-white. And then this one is going to be important, useful, or later, but we'll add it now actually. So we'll add a margin bottom, 20 pixels. And then we'll go ahead and add some other things like padding, just 20 pixels. So everything looks spaced out a little bit better. We're going to actually create one more style, and that's going to be our display. Let's see, where should I put this? I'll put it. I messed up. I'll actually add another class. So we'll make this something a little bigger because it looks a little small. And then inside of this, we'll have another div. And in this div, we're actually going to have another class. And we're going to call that our display. And again, if you're at all behind, we will like, I'll make sure to post this code at the end so you have access to it. And what we're going to do is we're going to use some of those things we talked about earlier, and we're going to make style this just a little bit better. We're basically just going to put this text over here and make it look kind of like how it does in my milestones. So in our display style, this actually isn't much React related yet. This is all just set up. That'll be helpful, useful. We're going to go ahead and add a display flex, and we'll do our flex direction row to move it over here. We might want to add like maybe a mark. Well, that should be fine for now. So now we have this kind of component. Doesn't look that great, but that's fine for this example. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time in a React demo creating CSS. So we're actually going to kind of move on now and move this into a component. So now this exists in our app.js, and it looks great. But we could make this more useful by putting it inside of a component. So we're actually going to create a folder called components, and we're actually inside this components folder. We're going to put two things because we're going to make a recipe component. So we're going to need a recipe.jsx file, and we're also going to have a recipe.css file. You don't need to have both of these. You can put your CSS in this app.css if you want, but it makes more sense for us to kind of keep it on the same level. So if we add styles somewhere, it doesn't go anywhere else. So in our recipe.jsx, we have this new file template we haven't seen before, and there is some boilerplate we're going to need to add so that we can use React. First thing we're going to do is we're going to actually have to import React. That's going to look like import React from React. And then we also have to import those CSS files. So we can do import/recipe.css. And we should see that. And then we've seen this before, but the export default function and then the name of your component. If it's only going to have one component in a page, you're going to use that default. If you're going to have multiple components in the same file, you're only going to need to put default on one of them. That's just kind of say, this is the main component, and then you can use these other components. We'll call this component recipe, and we'll actually put it in this. And then we're going to have that return statement we saw, and that should be good for our boilerplate after we add that. So we're good now. And we're actually going to copy the code over from here and put this code into our new component like so. Make sure they're lined up. Sweet. And now we have this new recipe component. We're not doing anything with that, so we're going to put this component into our app.js. So we're going to need to import it. So we'll import recipe, and again, that's got to be in capitals. Make sure the first letter is capital, same here. And then now we can actually go ahead and see this. We see, oh, wow, our component we created, we moved it somewhere else, but it doesn't exist anywhere. What should we do with that? Now we can actually, because we imported it here, we can create a new custom tag called recipe. You can have it be a self or a non-self closing component like so. But for us, we'll just have it be a self-contained tag here. So if we refresh, we can see, wow, we put this thing in a component. It doesn't look that great, but we did it. And we can kind of start to see, like, right now it might not be practical because we just kind of moved it somewhere else. We didn't really do anything unique. But if we wanted to duplicate that code and have another one, all we'd have to do is create another recipe tag like so. So now we should see two of them. There's two. Wow, that was an easy way to add a lot of code. And we can actually do that exact same thing and create as many as we want very easily. And I think we're going to continue and come back to this demo in a little bit. We're going to add to it and extend on to it. But for now, we kind of just created a component and we saw how easy it is to reuse code. Again, right now it's 3 pasta primaveras. Pasta primavera, I promise, is not that tasty of a dish, so you're probably not going to want to have it 3 times. But we'll change that in our demo in a bit. Does anybody have any questions for this part of the demo? I know that was rushed. There's a lot of content to cover. But yeah, any questions so far? Sweet. So back to the presentation. Going on and into prompts.
Okay. Yeah, so as we showed in this demo, React kind of allows you to make new like new tags that you can like reuse in your HTML. So you don't have to copy and paste HTML over and over and over again. But as we also just saw, right now we have 3 pasta primaveras. And what we need to be able to do is make these React components so they look the same, but we can change the content inside of them. So if you think of a React component as a function, props are the input into that function. Oh, shoot. Yeah, I can't reach. Thank you. So a little bit of terminology before we get into what the syntax for props are. Like all HTML, React is kind of built in a tree. So you have components nested in components. So for example, if I had an unordered list, the UL would be like a parent component, and then each LI would be a child component of that UL. And React follows the exact same structure in that regard. So parent is the outermost layer, child is the inner layer. So what props allow us to do is it allows us to pass like data from the parent component to the child component. So in the demo Cole was giving, app.js, which was like the component we were rendering, would have the child component recipe. So if you like see that tag recipe, that's a child inside of app because we're putting a recipe inside of app.js. And props will essentially allow us to specify how we want the recipe to look like from within the app.js file. So the actual syntax for that, if you look at this code example at the bottom, the top is going to be the parent. So it would be like the app.js and the demo. So const cart element equals shopping cart items equals 10. And what that items is similar to like how an anchor tag is going to have an href or an image tag is going to have a source. You can create your own kind of HTML attributes, and those get passed down as props. So in this case, the items prop is going to be equal to 10. And then if we look at the shopping cart component, which is at the like below that dashed line, inside of like the parentheses for that function, there's going to be the term props, and that's going to be a JavaScript object. And each like HTML attribute that you assign to shopping cart is going to be passed down as like an attribute in that object. So if you look at the like right near the end of the line, yeah, number of items is props.items. So props is just an object, and you're getting the value of items. So in this case, when you render the shopping cart with items equal to 10, it's going to be a p tag with number of items and then a 10. Is that making sense so far? So it's really just it's input for your function. It's just everything gets passed down as this object called props. And then how are props useful? As we've kind of gone over, it allows us to communicate between like a parent and a child component. And then it allows us to reuse components without having to like make a new one if you make like a slight alteration. So again, this is just reducing the amount of times we have to copy and paste code. So if we want multiple shopping carts with different colors, we could use the same cart component and then pass down a different color prop for each different color of shopping cart we want. So now we're going to go into the demo, I believe, and that's going to show you how you can use props in order to change that recipe component.
Sweet. So we're going to be continuing where we left off with the demo. We're actually going to be adding props into them. Let me hide these meeting controls. As always, let's open back up the React app and see where we left off. So if you were following along, that's great. I'm going to actually steal some code, and it's going to be quite a bit of code. And it's not like that React code. It's just going to be an array of React objects or of JavaScript objects. And it's going to be like the recipe data that I guess we kind of are going to use, and we're going to see why it's useful. So I guess in this, what we're going to steal, we can see that there's 3 different recipes. There's like Loco Moco, there's the Caprese salad, and pasta primavera. We're going to end up taking this data and be putting this into props and seeing how that's used. Sweet. So we're going to create a new file and put that data in there. Let's put it in our source file. And we'll just call it something like data.js. And we can go ahead and copy what I stole. And so basically, one more time, this is a JavaScript variable. It's an array of objects. So we have 3 different objects. We have our first one, which is, contains some recipe information. Then we have our second object which contains different information than our third ones. And then we're going to want to make sure we export that, I guess, variable we created so that we can see it on a different page. And that page is going to be inside of our app.js. So we're going to go ahead and import. That was a bad naming on my part. Probably shouldn't have recipe and then lowercase recipes, but we'll keep with it for now. And we're actually gonna go ahead and delete some of these components because we're only gonna end up needing one. So as Vance mentioned earlier, we can put JavaScript inside of our HTML inside of our JavaScript. So we're gonna create a map, and what that map is gonna do is loop through each of these objects in this object array. So we can do recipes.map, and then we'll put a recipe in here. Why is that bugging out? And then back in here, we'll do our arrow function and enter, and we should have created a map. And now if we actually put this recipe tag in here, we should see one recipe created for each, I guess, each object in the object array. So rather than having 3 different recipe tags like we had earlier with the like recipe, we're just going to have one that gets mapped. And so if we go back to our code, we can see 3 different objects. Granted, these objects are still all of the same. And so we're going to continue on and work with props and use that information inside of our code. So when we're adding a prop, I guess in the shopping cart example, we added items, but we're going to take some of the data such as the name, description, and the image. So for each recipe in the recipes, we're going to call it recipes. So we can do something like name is equal to recipe dot name. We have that. Now inside of our recipe, we don't do anything with it yet, but if we add it as a prop, we'll be able to use that name attribute here. Then we had an image, I guess it was a image source. So it's a link to an image. So we'll say recipe dot image source. We can actually just change the names if we want to. It doesn't need to be the same thing as your value. We can go ahead and change that name. And then we had a description, so we can call it desk. And then recipe dot description. And this doesn't do anything yet. I don't know if React will throw an error right away, but now inside of our recipe component, which is inside of our recipe.jsx file, we now will have access to these variables. So we can actually put those props here as like so. And now if we wanted to change the name dynamically, we can do what we saw in the slides and do props.name. So now if we refresh, we can see that all of the names in each array get updated. So now we don't see pasta primavera 3 times. We see simple caprese salad, we see loco moco, and pasta primavera. Continuing forward, we can change the source, which we stole. So we can use props.source. What was it called? It was called image. So we can do props.image, and now each one of these should be their respective image. See, it's starting to become kind of powerful. We're using data, which we're going to end up storing in a database, but for now it's just from a file, and we're actually putting it here inside of our code. And then the final thing to do is we're going to add that description. So we can do props.description. I think I called it desk. And here we go. We have this description. Again, the CSS isn't great, but now we actually have 3 unique props, all dynamically rendered. Each one is its own component, and that's pretty cool. That's super powerful. Let me think if there's anything else I need to show for the demo. There's nothing. I'll say there's one other way you can import props. Sometimes you might forget what your props were called. I remember I had to go back and like look, oh, it was image, oh, it was description. Another way you can import it is by doing something like this. and we can actually just put our props here. So names, image, and description. And then now if we want to use them, we don't even need to have props anymore. We can just put them inside tags like name, image, and description. And that's going to do the exact same thing we just saw. It's just a style preference. Feel free to use either in your projects. But you might see it in some examples somewhere, so I thought I'd cover it.
If you do use that one, make sure you don't forget the curly braces though. So you have parentheses, curly braces, and then your input names.
Yeah. So is there any questions about any of the code, what it's doing, or about the demo? Hopefully you guys can start to see like how this is powerful. And yeah, I think that's it for this demo. Hopefully you guys found that helpful. We'll move back to the slides. Present. So that's it for today. I know we went a few minutes over. Hopefully it didn't feel too rushed. There's a lot more we could cover, and we will cover some more at one of our later bootcamp sessions. But yeah.
All right, so just a few quick general updates before we break for the day. So again, project milestone due is due tomorrow at midnight. Feel free to let us know if you have any questions about it, need help submitting it or anything. And then we do have a feedback form that we created yesterday to just kind of get some of y'all's input on how bootcamp's going for you so far, what we could do to make it better, what you like about it so far. So we have a QR code that'll just take you to the form on the screen. It's totally anonymous. If you want to fill it out, that'd help us a lot. The form's on the Slack as well, so if you don't want to do it right now, you can do it later. And then also not next Thursday, so just be sure to plan for that general meeting next week. And then I think that's everything for today. So see y'all next week. Thanks for coming.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm gonna remember to get like
It's kind of a pain.
yeah, like I have like everything like my back end runs and my front end runs. It's just like the database.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Did you get the environment variable?
yeah. I use like the
So-
one that shows you like.
Yeah, so the database is still the thing.
I forgot to say we're sticking around till 8.
So I was originally.
Oh, yeah.
Originally,
Oh,
just
well.
like a UI project, right?
Maybe
So we
we're not.
originally used that.
Yeah,
Once we kinda, like,
can
branched off, we
you
have, like, a different
pause
data
the recording,
structure
stop
and
it?
stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think what we might end up needing to do is just
I know like usually it's like.
with that
you don't wanna, like,
database that Eric gave you was, right?
Yeah,
I think we just need to put data in. So,
Well, you wanna go
with some-
submit?
yeah.
like,
I
it's
already
like-
started.
Okay, cool.